since positivism with its ideal language philosophy, and as well since the ordinary language philosophy development of the 1940s, 50s, which we've been talking about in connection with philosophy of religion and ethics. More recent developments of philosophy of language have involved developments in metaphysics, in ontology. That would be so shouldn't be a great surprise when we recognize that the categories of thought, categories of being, for Aristotle, for Hegel, and that in that sense the logical categories evident in language would be related to ontology. And particularly when we're talking of the demise of logical positivism and the way in which its reductionist view of language eliminated metaphysics, it's understandable that new views of language would open up to metaphysics. And if you want to get some glimpse of this, one of the sources which you'd find helpful is a book by John Passmore that was published, I think, 6 years ago. John Passmore's book, it's not Recent Philosophy, but Recent Philosophers. Recent Philosophers, which you will find a helpful summary of this sort of thing, though it's by no means complete. Now, I want to divide what I want to look at here into three topics, all three of which sound like topics in metaphysics, dealing with ontology. And indeed they are. The first has to do with logical entities, in addition to physical entities and mental states. Is there a third kind of object, logical objects of an unchanging sort? It's analogous to asking, are there real universals? Except that it's sometimes asked in terms of essences, and sometimes in terms of logical objects, logical entities. Now, how does this sort of question arise in connection with language? And we have to go back to Frege, who in the early part of this century was quite influential. He died in 1925. Frege distinguished between sense and reference in regards to language. That is to say, you can have a sentence, which has both sense and reference. Now, the reference, of course, is to that which it is about. If it's a sense datum statement, it would be about sense data. If it's a material object statement, it would be about material objects. If a statement's about God, then the reference would be to God. Reference in that sense. But the word sense, the sense of the sentence, has to do with its logical meaning. With its logical meaning. That is to say, a sentence stands for a proposition, where a proposition is not just a sentence, a statement, but is an objective state of affairs, okay, an objective state of affairs, which can be talked about in a variety of sentences, some in English, some in French, some in German, some in Dutch, some in Japanese, so on and so forth, you name it. So the proposition is the logical state of affairs which a sentence which is the meaning of the sentence. And of course, that logical state of affairs can have reference to things like sense data, material objects, and so on and so forth. So that distinction becomes important. You might have a proper name, for instance, the sense of which, the meaning of which might be very significant. You're named after someone, the word has all sorts of connotations, and at the same time, the sense of the proper name is to be distinguished from its reference. It refers to you as the individual who has been given that proper name. The name, the sense, the reference to the individual. Or you might be thinking of some other abstract term, or some general term, okay, where the sense has to do with the concept, whether it be a universal concept or a general concept, okay, and the reference is to a whole set of individuals, a whole class of individuals. Perhaps the reference is to real universals. So distinguish then between sense and reference. Sometimes we distinguish them by talking of sense as the intentional meaning and reference as the extensional meaning. Extensional meaning, yes, we use the term extension in talking in logic, do we not? The extension of a noun, as it's used in a sentence. All men are mortal, universal extension, some men particular extension. That having to do with the reference. The intention having to do with the sense. Now, Karl Popper distinguishes, however, not just these two worlds of sense and reference, but distinguishes a third world. That is to say, in addition to physical objects, to which a sentence can refer, in addition to physical objects, there are two things that are involved here at the intentional level. There are, first of all, mental states. What it is that's running through your mind. The mental state, which can be empirically described in terms of ideas of reflection, those subjective conditions. And then he distinguishes from that the logical objects of that mental state. So that you might be thinking in terms of some logically objective state of affairs that is thought, not seen, even though what you are thinking there in that logical state of affairs has reference to something else. And the classic case would be when you're talking of universals. So that your mental state has to do with certain words which are the vehicles for the logical object, which is the universal, the real universal essence, an objective state of affairs that is unchangingly what it is. A is always A, so forth. The logical object as distinct from the physical object. So even if you take then the language and the mental states which we have, which we experience, logical object, the physical object. The logical object would be the essential nature of humanness. The physical object, humans. So logical objects, logical entities come in that sort of context. Now, as you could well imagine, This notion of logical objects, to which Frege and Popper are saying yes, is going to be challenged by anybody with a strongly empiricist bent. And that's precisely the case with W.V.O. Quine, who challenged it in an essay of his called Logic Without Ontology. Logic without ontology. His view, you see, is that logic does not need that intentional object, that language does not need that intentional object, that logically objective state of affairs which cannot be otherwise, does not need essences, does not need universals. All that language needs is simply predicates and qualifiers. Predicates and qualifiers. Predicates that have empirical reference, and qualifiers which have formal functions. So if we want to say simply that some men are mortal, then in saying some men were making reference to certain empirical entities, physical entities. Mortality is an empirical property predicated of some men. Some is simply a logical qualifier. All we need, you see, is those sorts of things. And he's quick to point out that we can therefore state such things, such statements, in logical terms using the symbolism of ideal language. There exists some x's such that x is human and x is mortal. Some men are mortal. Okay. And if you want to make it all, simply have it's true of all x's that if x is human, then x is mortal. So you can play simply with logical qualifiers that we do in the formalities of formal logic, and terms that have empirical reference. Now, what Quine is trying to say, and it makes very explicit, is that meanings are functions of language, not of mental states. The question when something is uttered is not, what are you thinking of, but what are you referring to? What are you talking about, you see? He takes language, that is to say, he takes language to be verbal behavior, a kind of overt physical behavior. He's only interested in thought insofar as it is expressed in the symbolism of language. Thought is not psychological activity uniquely. It is verbal behavior. You don't have to utter it out loud. You formulate it in your mind. The language symbols, language behavior. So universal terms like roundness, humanness, are not names for essences, logical objects. They are simply terms